Well, hello there. Thanks for joining me. I am Dr. Jen, and I am so pleased that you have joined me for today's show, all about the specific tenancy guidelines for Minnesota. Minnesota. In all of my location specific episodes, I've included all kinds of hyperlinks to the state or province for that landlord tenant code. And if you've seen any of my other location specific episodes, which I've got quite a bit going on here, got more than a few in the library, and it's adding up over time, which is great. But today is all about Minnesota. Uh, so each of my location specific podcasts is set up the exact same way, answering the same four questions. I go straight into tenancy landlord laws for that location, whether I'm in a US state like Minnesota, or Canadian province territory, US district. We're doing District of Columbia this tranche as well. So we talk about what are the basics in landlord tenancy law. We talk about what stands out, and then what do you do with abandoned items when a tenancy goes sideways and the tenant departs or gets imprisoned or dies or something happens and you end up with their stuff. What do you do? And then lastly, we answer what do you do when you need help? Where can you just go to just start in Minnesota? But I got to tell you, this is not the end all be all of anything. This will get you started, but you've got to do your own research. You've got to do your own guidance, especially because you know where your rentals are. And if you're listening to this about Minnesota, likely your rentals are in Minnesota. But if you're in Minnesota and your rentals are somewhere else, you kind of need to change up. You need to learn the game where your rentals are, but you need to do your own research. Even if I'm 1,000% correct as of the time of this recording, as soon as I finish, 5 minutes later, the laws could all change. But this will at least get you started and give you some guidance. Okay, let's see. What are we going to do? Yes, at the end of this, I will go through what I call my bingo card. Because I've done so many of these location specific podcasts, I have developed my own checklist of things that I just look for depending on what location we're at. And we'll go through my bingo card, which is the most standard items I see for location specific podcasts, so location specific episodes. And I'll review what's there and what's missing, and then what kind of stands out. There's always at least one thing that stands out, which is kind of interesting. I have to give a shout out to today's sponsor, Aloha Capital Investments LLC, which is Mike and I in our real estate investment. If you want to know what we're up to, check it out. We're at alohajv.com. And at this point, I am going to share my screen. So if you're watching this on YouTube at My Life as a Landlord, you will be able to follow along with me, but you don't have to. You can also listen to this if you're just listening to it. That's fine. Let me go in and share my screen. Give me just a sec here. And there we are. Okay. So in today's show notes, I have 5 different PDFs, different hyperlinks that is specifically for Minnesota landlord-tenant laws. So the first one that we're coming up with, I'm just literally going to go through the hyperlinks that are in the show notes. If I discover something throughout the show recording, and I will add it into the show notes. I mean, the whole idea here is to set you up for success and to give you a running start on this. I personally do not have rentals in Minnesota, but let's see what they say about landlord and tenant right and responsibilities. Now, this is the Attorney General, Keith Ellison, Office of Minnesota Attorney General. This is cool. And so they typically will do lots of other things other than just housing. So you'll see that there's healthcare, charities, topics. Okay, fine. But for landlord and tenant rights and responsibilities, there is a brochure, and it gets just into the basics here. Entering into a lease during the tenancy, ending the tenancy, and then other important laws. This is interesting that they do background checks of property managers, cold weather rule. That's new. I haven't seen that before in too many other areas. I do see quite a bit manufactured home park residents. There's a little bit different if you own your home versus if you are renting the home, right? Like if it's an apartment versus an RV, for example, or a tiny home, something else, right? Yeah, so let's just jump into it. Oh, these are all hyperlinks. Okay, entering into a lease. Let's just go through these. Entering into a lease, you've got to have something written. Inspecting the unit before signing a lease. Yeah. Good idea. Applicants have additional protections that are discussed below. Screening fees, pre-lease fees. So this is all about an applicant's screening fee. A landlord must disclose in writing what the fee is for, right? And basically, it's got to recap what you're screening them. So background check, criminal record check, credit check. Yeah, and it also tells you what you can. A landlord may not charge a screening fee when the landlord knows or should have known that no rental unit is available at the time. So you can't just be collecting fees knowing that you don't have a vacancy or knowing that someone is going to be rejected. So you can't do that. And you've got to return it. You've got to return the applicant screening fee if you don't rent to them, right? The applicant is rejected for any reason. Other than you can't, obviously discrimination, you cannot do that. And if the landlord doesn't actually check references, if they don't check background or criminal or consumer credit report, then you actually have to give the money back, right? So no landlord may deny a rental application based on a pending eviction action. That's interesting. Any court file that is not public has been expunged or destroyed, or an eviction that has not resulted in a writ of recovery of premises, basically a writ of possession. You can't judge them on that. Additionally, a landlord must not deny a rental application solely because the prospective tenant provided an individual taxpayer identification number instead of a social security number. That's interesting. Landlords can also charge pre-lease deposits to hold a unit. Yes, you can do that, just in case someone wants to know that. I'm just going to take a note about the TIN versus social. Minnesota cannot deny. Interesting. Okay, residential tenant reports. This is residential tenant report is basically a either verbal or written, or looks like it says other communication, looks like it could be an email of a residential tenant screening service that includes information about their creditworthiness, general reputation, personal characteristics, and others that is expected to be used or to approve or deny tenancy. So like if you hire someone to do a criminal record check or a background check, that is a residential tenant report in this. Let's see, Fair Credit Reporting Act. Yeah. And typically in the US, what I do is I will ask the tenant if they already have a credit report with the score. You've got to have both, credit report with the score within the last 30 days. If they do, I'll just take a copy of that. I don't need to pull an additional credit report because remember, the tenant pays for that in the US. In Canada, they don't, but in the US, they do. So this still applies in Minnesota as well, of course. So, okay. So security deposits. Landlords usually require security deposit moved in. It's also sometimes called a damage deposit, which is misleading because it's not, it can't always be applied to damage, right? It's security. The landlord in this case can use it to pay unpaid rent or any money that the landlord is owed. And tenants are required to pay the last month, and the landlord does not have to accept. So this is always a sticking point, especially if you've got a security deposit that is equal to 1 month's rent, and people just say, "Oh, just keep my security deposit. I'm leaving in a month." Well, it doesn't actually work that way. Yes, it's still money, but a lot of tenants get really confused on that. A lot of landlords get confused with that too. So Minnesota law does not set a limit for the amount that the landlord may require for a security deposit, but some cities like Minneapolis have an ordinance that set the limit on the amount. Yes, so no set security deposit for the state. Interesting. Okay. All right. Construction delays. This happens when you are creating a unit or renovating a unit and you are not able to deliver it to the tenant. That's pretty bad. So construction delays, this is interesting. So it says beginning January 1, 2025, if rental housing under construction is under construction, but the landlord learns it won't be ready by the move-in date, the landlord must within 7 days and prior to the move-in date notify every tenant affected and either provide them alternate housing, which is equivalent in size, amenities, etc., or pay them the equivalent of the rent established in the lease to mitigate the costs of the alternative housing. or just terminate the lease, give everything back, which is terrible, especially if you're can you imagine you're 7 days out from moving into a brand new place and everything gets canceled? Wow. Yeah, that's really tough. Yeah, and then it talks about if it gets delayed and then the tenant wants to move in for the new unit, even if it's delayed. Okay, so this talks about the lease. There's a difference between building containing more units than not, but if a unit is less than 12 units, then the owner may use an oral agreement for a lease. Okay, if you've been a fan of the show for a while, you will know that if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So please do not just rely on an oral lease. It doesn't end well. And if you have a dispute, the first thing that you have to submit is the lease. So please, oral leases never lead to success in my history here. So, okay, let's see. Yeah, written lease, It talks about attorney's fees, periodic leases, which is month-to-month fees, month-to-month. Let's see. So if the lease does not state the notice requirement, when ending a tenancy, state laws require that written notice be given one full rental period plus 1 day before the rental tenancy ends. So if the lease has no rent or into, okay, so for example, a tenant with month-to-month tenancy who wishes to leave at the end of June would have to give notice no later than May 31. So basically one full lease period if you're month to month. And that seems to be pretty standard. Sometimes they do it by days, but in Minnesota they do it one full rental period plus 1 day. Okay. Definite lease terms, lengths restricting some leases. If the building sells or it's foreclosed on, what do? Required disclosures to the tenant. Let's see, landlords are required to disclose certain information to prospective tenants so that they can make an informed decision about what home to rent. Some of the required disclosures are about the cost to rent the home and other repair issues. Okay, so mandatory fees must be disclosed. Things like advertisements that display the rent amount must also display the non-optional fees like administrative fees for the rental. And leases must include the total of non-optional fees and the monthly rent on the first page. It must be described as total monthly payment. And of course, landlords must disclose whether utilities are included or not in both the lease and the advertisements. This is really interesting because it just seems that the only reason they would have it in here this specific is because people in the past have not done that. So, health and safety disclosures, code violations, that can be an issue. Lead paint, talks about lead paint. That's a federal requirement to disclose that. Utility billing disclosure, we talked about that. And then move-in inspection. Within the start of the tenancy, within 14 days of move-in, you've got to do a move-in inspection. Okay, and then the next one. I think there are some more. This is just the first hyperlink I've got. So we can talk about this, about payment of rent. And I know there's some other resources I want to go through as well. Oh, talk about late fees. Oh, here we go. Now we're getting into it. Okay, rent must be paid on the date it is due. If the rent is paid after the due date, a tenant can be charged a late fee, but only if the tenant and the landlord have agreed in writing that a late fee may be charged, which means it needs to be in your lease, landlords. The written agreement must state that when the late fee is charged, many landlords provide a grace period before imposing the late fee. However, law limits late fees to a maximum of 8% of the unpaid rent amount. 8% of unpaid is the late fee. Wow. Okay, and then how do you calculate the rent amount? Okay, so they have this. If the tenant and the landlord agree in writing, for example, that the late fee is 5% and the tenant fails to pay $100 of their rent, then their late fee would be $5. Okay, fair enough. Raising the rent under a periodic tenancy, so month-to-month tenancy, a landlord cannot raise the rent unless the landlord gives proper notice. That's pretty standard. Proper notice is one rental period plus 1 day. And they have hyperlinks all over the place on explanation of proper notice. In fact, let's open that up. Let's see what it says. Proper notice. Okay, that just goes into what that is. Okay, fair enough. Okay, apportioned utilities. This is talking about if you've got 1 meter, whether it's an electric or gas meter, and how to dally it up, how to cut it up. And you've got to actually provide calculations. Tenant's right to privacy. The landlord may only enter tenancy unit for a reasonable business purpose. This is talking about abusive access. The landlord is limiting entry between the hours of 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. And it gives examples of business purposes, which would be showing the unit, repairs, performing housekeeping, doing a wellness check, doing a mischief check. Maybe they think that the tenant is doing something wrong. Tenants may seek police and emergency assistance. Yes, indeed. And then repairs and maintenance. You've got to, in Minnesota, the landlord is responsible for keeping the unit in reasonable repair. This is called a covenant and it cannot be waived. And it's got to be habitable. This is a habitable agreement. Oh, and this is where it's talking about the cold weather stuff. Supply heat at a minimum temperature of 68 degrees Fahrenheit from October 1 to April 30th. Interesting. Also, the landlord must exterminate insects, rodents, and other pests in the building. And if you're going to do external stuff and the tenant's going to do some of it, then that has to be in writing as well. Again, you can see an oral lease does not make sense. You've got to have it in writing. It never ends well if you don't have it in writing. Okay, let's see. Repair problems and housing law violations. I'm gonna keep going on this because I'm assuming that you're gonna be smart and you're gonna review this, but if you need a remedy on some of this, like if you are being a deadbeat landlord, you probably wouldn't be listening to this podcast. So lead-based paint, we've talked about this already. Uninhabitable or condemned buildings, neighborhood organizations, tenant organizing. And it's probably going to talk about landlord retaliation here, which it might not. Interesting. Okay. Okay. All right. So that was during the tenancy. Like they're talking about making repairs, proper notice to the landlord. If the landlord isn't making these repairs, then what can the tenant do? Okay. Make your repairs. Okay. Ending the tenancy. So proper notice. Oh, this was the other page I just opened up. Okay. So proper notice is 1 month, basically one payment period plus 1 day. Okay, so this is interesting. This is talking about if you've got a definite term tenancy, so a fixed term tenancy. So let's say it's for a year, 6 months, whatever it is, and the tenant breaks the lease. Often in such cases, the tenant is required to pay a break lease fee, a sum of money, or the tenant's security deposit. And we have something very similar. And you've got to make sure you're giving proper notice. But if you do break the lease, there should be some penalty for that. And holdover tenants. So the term holdover meaning the lease does not automatically convert to a month-to-month tenancy. Anytime I see holdover, that means it ends abruptly. You have a fixed lease, like a 1-year lease, and it ends abruptly. And the term holdover is only because the tenants didn't leave after that time. That's what holdover means. If it automatically converts, you wouldn't see this term holdover because it wouldn't exist. So it says if there's no condition in the lease about what happens when the lease ends, for example, nothing is said about converting the tenancy to a month-to-month tenancy, the lease simply expires and the tenant becomes a holdover tenant, and the lease is then renewed on a month-to-month basis. Some leases in rural areas are renewed for a full term. So you need to know that this is part of your homework, knowing where your rentals are. You need to know if that applies to you or not. Okay, so it's talking about evictions, moving early, Section 8 housing, rights of victims of violence to terminate the lease. This is very standard that if it's not safe, that a tenant can basically give immediate notice and they need to leave. Okay, 3-day notice during winter. This is very interesting. Cold winter. 3-day notice. Tenants who vacate their units between November 15th and April 15th must tell their landlord they're vacating at least 3 days prior to them moving, which allows the landlord time to take steps to make sure the pipes don't freeze. The tenant's failure to notify the landlord is a misdemeanor. 3-day notice of tenant departure. Wow. I don't see that here on Maui. Okay, move out inspection, return of the security deposit. Let's talk about that for a second. At the end of the tenancy, the landlord must return a tenant security deposit plus interest of 1%. Okay. If a landlord deducts part of the deposit or is not returning any of the deposit, the landlord must give a written explanation why they're not returning the deposit, and they must do this within 21 days after the tenancy ends, provided that here's always the caveat, big asterisk always, the tenant has given the landlord a forwarding address. If the tenant's just left, the landlord, it looks like you might want to check this with legal aid, but the landlord has 21 days provided that the tenant has given the landlord a forwarding address. If the landlord does not return the deposit, if you don't give an explanation in the time allowed or provide an initial inspection and a move out inspection when requested, the tenant must pay a penalty equal to the amount withheld and interest and pay the tenant the amount of this. Basically, you're paying double. You're paying double. Typically, it's either a multiple of 2 or a multiple of 3. So in this case, it's a multiple of 2. Interesting. Okay, and then it goes in and talks about deductions, normal wear and tear, things that are beyond ordinary wear and tear, which would be willful damage. Also, overdue water bills. It's talking about taking money out of that security deposit. Talks about how to calculate interest and then taking the matter to court. Remember, small claims is typically where security deposits are battled out, is in small claims. Okay, this is where it gets into other important laws. Background checks of property managers. So it's talking about when hiring a manager, they cannot be a convict of a first or second degree murder, first degree manslaughter, first, second, third degree assault, kidnapping. Oh my goodness. Holy cow. This is like violent crimes. Like we're talking felons here. Okay. All landlords must request background checks on all currently employed managers. Oh my goodness. Wow. I've never seen that before. Talks about eviction procedures. I'm going to leave that to it. If you need it, check it out. I've given you the hyperlink so you're set up for success if you need it. Expungement. Oh, here we go. Storage of personal property. This is part of my hit list for this episode. In cases where tenant's property is left behind, when either the sheriff or police officer, maybe a bailiff, is removing the tenant, the landlord must make a list called an inventory of the property and have it signed and dated in the presence of the sheriff. Oh, interesting. A copy of the inventory must be mailed to the tenant at the tenant's last known address or to an address provided by the tenant. And it could also be the address of the unit, especially if they just got taken away in cuffs. Interesting. A list of the items of personal property and description of the condition of that property, date and signature of the landlord, name, phone number of the person authorized to release the property, name and badge number of the sheriff or police officer. Wow. Interesting. And then the officer must keep an inventory, the list of the inventory. The landlord must remove, store, and take care of the personal property of the tenant for 28 days. That's how this works when you're talking about abandonment. It's always what's the notified period and what's the storage period. Well, notified period looks like immediately, and then the storage period is 28 days. And yeah, you've got to make good faith effort to try to get a hold of the tenant. But again, if the tenant is in property or maybe in prison or maybe they're in a hospital or something, some reason, or maybe they've passed away, right? You got to deal with the estate then, right? To get the property back, what do? Eviction for illegal activities. Yeah, every oral and written residential lease now includes a requirement of the following activities not be allowed. No prostitution. No allowing stolen property or property to obtain from a robbery. No illegal use or possessing of firearms, and nothing involving cannabis. No, wait a minute. Making, selling, possessing, purchasing, or allowing illegal drugs, however, not regarding cannabis. I misspoke. It's not so. Seizure of property, foreclosure, here we go. Let's talk about retaliation for a second. Now, when we're talking landlord retaliation, this is how places define a landlord, basically trying to get back at a tenant for typically turning them in for code violations, forming a tenants union or something, and the landlord is not allowed to do something like try to file for eviction, cut off their utilities, try to downplay their amenities, like trying to take their amenities away. There's a bunch of stuff. So I'm going to read this in here because this is really interesting because some places define it and some places don't. So, but Minnesota does, which is good. A landlord may not evict a tenant or end a tenancy in retaliation for the tenant's good faith attempt to enforce a tenant's rights, nor can a landlord respond to such an attempt by raising the rent, cutting services, or otherwise adversely changing the rental terms. For instance, if a tenant has reported the landlord to a governmental agency for violating health, safety, housing, or building codes, the landlord cannot try to get even by evicting the tenant. Further, tenants who organize with other tenants to assert their rights are also protected from retaliation. Now, the biggest thing for landlord retaliation is there is typically a time frame in which the landlord is not allowed to make any changes. They can't try to evict them. They can't try to decrease their amenities. They can't be this retaliation period. There's usually a retaliation period. In Minnesota, it is within 90 days of the tenant's action. The law presumes that if the landlord is retaliating, if within 90 days of the tenant's action, the landlord starts an eviction action or give tenants a notice to vacate, that it will be up to the landlord to prove the eviction is not retaliatory. Meaning if they're up to no good or they're doing mischievous things or illegal activities, that there's a legitimate reason why they're trying to evict. However, if the landlord's notice to vacate comes more than 90 days after the tenant exercises the tenant's right, then the tenant has to prove that the eviction is retaliatory. And of course, the provisions also apply to oral rental agreements. You know how I think about that. Okay. Utility shutoffs, don't do it. You can read all about this. Oh, here's another thing, the cold weather rule. I think this is the 3-day, maybe not. Hang on a second. Let's read this cold weather rule. This is really interesting. Cold weather rule. Minnesota legislature developed the cold weather rule to protect a tenant or homeowner from having their heat source permanently disconnected in the winter, which is considered October 15th through April 15th, if they are unable to pay their utility bills. The cold weather rule is implemented by the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission and does not prohibit shutoffs, but does provide the utility may not be disconnected and must reconnect a customer whose household income is either at or below 50% of the state median income if the customer enters into and makes reasonably. So if the customer is actually trying, then they can't cut it off. Cold weather rule applies to natural gas and electric utilities. Basically, all this stuff that supplies heat does not include delivered fuels such as fuel oil, propane, and wood, and does not affect. A cold weather rule does not prevent a landlord from evicting a tenant or refusing to renew a lease that expires during the cold weather season. It's just that they can't get cut off due to payments. No cutoff. This is interesting. October 15th to, what is it, April 15th. Interesting. Okay, disconnection notice, your right to appeal, discrimination, never a good thing. Accessible units, landlord contact disclosures, that should be in your lease anyway. Subleasing, oh, here's abandoned property. Didn't we talk about this already? Yeah, 28 days. Personal property must be inventoried. But the tenant, if the tenant comes back and wants their stuff, then they have to pay for all the moving, handling, care costs, and the landlord can sue them for that. Expanded definition of a tenant. Smoking in common areas. Okay, so references and resources. I'm just going to keep going to the right. Now here is a ton of help, places where you can get help on this stuff. So Minnesota Statute and Rules, Minnesota Office of Revisor of Statutes. So there's all kinds of hyperlinks in this. And I think I've got this. Oh, that's another book. So we're still only at the first hyperlink. So I'm going to kind of try to speed it up here. But 211 United Way hotline, that's always a good thing that you can figure that out. If you don't know where to start, pick up the phone and call 211. All kinds of legal aid offices, and just start calling people. If you're questioning or you've got a question, you're not sure how this is going to work, There's, goodness, probably 20 or more places that you can start. That's very cool. Okay, let's go to the second hyperlink. And there's a total of 5. So landlords and tenants' rights and responsibilities. I'm not going to go through this word for word, but definitely it looks like a lot of these are the same that we just went through on the website. But this is the, again, remember, this is landlord-tenant law. This is looks like a workbook from the law, right? So legal aid services, here's more help from the back of this as well, depending on where you are, but community programs, dispute resolution, questions or complaints. I mean, you can just call them. You've got a question, they'll tell you how to help you. Here's a ton of additional publications. Wow, my goodness, they have a ton of stuff in here. This is great. Well done, Minnesota. Wow, well done. Okay, so this one's 48 pages, and it looks like it's almost identical to what we just went through. So I'm not going to go through this. Yeah, it looks like identical. This is just the PDF. Okay. All right. Now you've got this is the third of the 5 hyperlinks that I have in the show notes. Lawhelpmn.org, helping Minnesotans solve legal problems. And so it goes all through here, how to, oh boy, it really has all kinds of repair problems when renting, renter safety, ending a lease, evictions and lockouts, security deposit. I don't think we have any of, let me just click on one. Reasonable accommodations. Oh, they have fact sheets. Okay, this is cool. Housing discrimination, reasonable accommodations in housing. What is a reasonable accommodation? It's when you change to accommodate someone's ability, right? You can request a reasonable modification, which is a structural or physical change in the unit built. So like installing grab bars in bathrooms. That is absolutely one of the most common things that we ask or that people ask of us, and we will happily install them. In fact, they then become part of the unit. The tenant can pay for it. We typically will pay for it and we will install it. Same thing if someone needs a ramp, when can the request be denied? If it infringes on the rights of other tenants or alters the basic programs of the building. Interesting. Who has to pay for the accommodations? Landlord is responsible typically. Yeah, very cool. Very cool. What are some examples? Yeah, this is a good one. Physically disabled tenant who needs to park closer, obviously. Guest parking fee for disabled tenant's home health care aid. Landlord makes an exception to no pets policy for a disabled person to have a service or emotional support animal. Remember, a service animal is not a pet. And I've got tons of episodes in the library on this. So don't make that mistake. A service animal is doing a job. They're actually doing a job. An emotional support animal is a huge gray area that's only typically in the States. Canada has not gotten into all this. If you have an emotional support alligator or peacock or something, very different. Very much a gray area. Okay, and then these are, tenant rights, housing discrimination, service and emotional support. So if you want to look further in here, it looks like there's quite a bit of resources in all of this. And looks like each one has all that. So ending a lease, notices to vacate and ending a lease, can my landlord enter my home? That's abusive access, getting my property back after move out. We've already hit that one already. Okay, so lots and lots of different fact sheets. That's actually really helpful. Okay, further, tenants' rights in Minnesota. I think this is one of the worksheets. How to check for code violations, rental costs. So this is talking about when you are entering into a lease. I'm not going to go through all this, but a booklet menu. Oh, there's a ton. Wow, look at this. Before renting an apartment, all the way down. Wow. Sample residential tenancy, sample residential lease, standard lease. Okay. Does it have a standard lease or residential lease agreement? You must request access to the free form through the Minnesota State Bar Association. Okay, I'm not going to do that now, but you can. So if you're in Minnesota and you're looking for a lease form, there it is. And if they don't have the updated one, I'm sure that they can point you to someone. Oh, and here's a sample letter asking and creating, okay, expunge case. Okay, interesting. Tons and tons of references here, and here's some more. And we've already hit this. This is all of the places that you can go for help, depending on where you are, depending on what you need. If you're just confused or not sure where to start, just start calling people, just start looking. You can start Googling, you can ask AI, but definitely legal aid. I really like legal aid services. It's typically free. And if there is a cost, especially to a landlord, if it is a cost, it's usually very minimal. It's usually like 20 or 30 or 50 bucks. It's really not a whole lot. And just say, this is what we need to do. Yeah, very cool. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing screen and I'm going to go through my bingo card now. So I think we've hit just about everything. I'm just kind of mentally thinking of what we've got here. Tenant application fee, we talked about that. Is there a grace period for late rent without a penalty? The answer is no. They're saying that rent is due when rent is due, and then it's up to the lease to dictate what when the late fee is going to be charged, especially, and then what the late fee amount is. As stated, it is a flat percentage up to 8% for a late fee, but it has to be in writing. Security deposit method, it looks like there's a payment. It didn't say anything about keeping the security deposit in a separate account or a trust account, but it did say you have to pay interest. So maybe you have to have it in an interest bearing account. Didn't say about where that account needed to be though. So it could be in a different location. You know, certain locations require it to be, if you're in Minnesota, it requires that it would be in that state, but it doesn't say anything like that for security deposits. So that's interesting. Emergency contact required in the event of tenant abandonment, incapacitation, death, or imprisonment? It is not required, but it is certainly best practice. Pets and animals. Is there a pet deposit or pet rent? There was nothing about pets in there. Delivery of signed lease required. Yes. 21 days. Condition inspection at move-in. Yes. If you are going to have a security deposit, you need it. Standard warning letters or wording. Not that I saw. I didn't see anything in there that said, hey, you need to write a letter that looked like this, that, and the other. Required maintenance inspections. Not that I saw. How often can the rent be increased? Oh, didn't talk about that. We might have to go back into it. In fact, let's do that. Let's go back into it because rent increase stuff is really important. Ending a lease. You know what? I bet it's in this one. This is the listing one. Let's go into rent increase during the tenancy, inhabitable, ending tenancy, other important ones. Rent increase. Proper notice. I don't see rent increase anywhere. Wow. Required notice. Da, 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 da. Okay, well, let's just Google it. Rent increases in Minnesota. SOTA. Let's see what they say. So Minnesota, landlords can raise rent at any time, provided they comply with necessary notice requirements. State does not have statewide rent control, but St. Paul, looks like certain cities have local rent stabilization ordinances. It looks like St. Paul has a rent stabilization ordinance that limits annual rent increases to 3% for new or existing tenants. Minneapolis is exploring rent control policies, but no firm ordinance. Okay, well, that's why we didn't see it, is because it wasn't there. So that's really interesting. Huh. Okay. All right. Let me keep going through the bingo card here. Where are we? Required maintenance. What is proper notice of the rent increase? It would probably be the same thing about rental, departing a rental unit. So that for 1 month and 1 day. So it looks like that's probably, I'm assuming that's what it would be, but you would want to check with legal aid if you're in Minnesota wanting to increase rent. How much can you increase the rent unless you're in one of those other municipalities? It looks like you can increase it as much as you want. Is renter's insurance required or mentioned? Nope. Is abusive access defined? Yes, it is. It's talking about access to in different hours and what you can access it for. Is landlord retaliation defined and or timing? Yes. Timing of eviction, rent increase or decrease of services. It says within 90 days of a tenant action. Is the end of a fixed lease abrupt? Yes, because it talks about holdover tenancy. It does not automatically convert to a periodic tenancy. Is a condition inspection at move out required? Yes, because you're holding a security deposit. Return of deposit or timing, 21 days. You must give the information, give the either the deposit or explanation on why you're not returning the deposit. Can you use the deposit as last month's rent? Yes or no? No, we saw that. How long can you give a notice of eviction due to non-payment of rent or utilities? You know what? I didn't look at any of the eviction stuff. I'm just going to leave that for now. How long till you can get possession of a unit? We did talk about abandoned items, so I'm not going to go into that. But that completes my bingo card. I'm trying not to get too deep in the weeds about eviction stuff, because if you're getting into an eviction situation, you need to do a deep dive, because even if I go through it right now, it could change in 10 minutes once I hit stop. So that I've given you enough resources here that if you need to learn more about eviction stuff in Minnesota, you can do it. Okay, let's wrap this up. Each of my location-specific podcasts is set up in the exact same way, answering the same 4 questions. What are the basics of that state, province, or district landlord housing governing document? What are the nuances of that location? What is different? What stands out? What is some guidance about abandoned items? And then last, but where can you get help in your local real estate location? Then I reviewed my bingo card of standard items I see most often in tenancy laws in different locations, and it's the same format for every location-specific episode. So if you're interested in another location or you're looking at rentals in another place, you already know the layout of all of these. I'm going to go through this. I'm going to screen share. You already know what I'm going to talk about, just in a different location. One more time, this episode is not all inclusive. You must research further in your specific area, including your county, regional district, parish, district, city, or any other governing body that involves your rental location. But today's episode will get you started. If you're listening to this podcast, chances are you are either new to real estate or you have real estate in Minnesota. Things you can do to help yourself is 1, read the Minnesota Landlord-Tenant Laws. I've given you all kinds of resources. You will be as well versed as you possibly can, and have a Rolodex of who you can call to get even more information. Second thing you can do is check out your local meetup group in your city, county, parish, wherever you are. And how do you find those, you might ask? Jump on social media, or if your local area has a next door, jump on there and ask where landlords are getting together. Where can local folks meet up and talk about different things? You want to get where people are asking the questions that you're asking, because they will help you. I hope you enjoyed today's show all about Minnesota. Don't forget to subscribe for more expert advice and real stories from across the rental property world. I'm recording this episode today from Maui, Hawaii. Why? Because real estate takes you places. Where do you want real estate to take you? Join me in the next episode live right now in the library, episode 192, about the Canadian province, Prince Edward Island. I will see you there.